Okay, so in yesterday's lecture, we put together the graphical formulation for really what sets up our ability to really dissect the sort of Keynesian idea of the macroeconomy and then set it against the classical, and then also give a nice little foundation for what we're going to do next week. The sort of cornerstone or centerpiece of this analysis is the so-called ISLM model. I think I mentioned this in the lectures yesterday. What's interesting about the ISLM model and really any sort of graphical or complex mathematical representation of Keynes's ideas did not originate, or he didn't come up with those formulations. Other economists read, interpreted, discussed with Keynes, what he meant, and then formulated that into a set of mathematical and graphical ideas. I said this was sort of similar to, kind of what Einstein had done, where Einstein had come up with all these ideas, and of course he did it in a more formalized mathematical way. But then we ran experiments years later when we actually had the technological capability to run those experiments, and we found that he was right about a lot of stuff. That's very similar to Keynes. So ultimately, the reason why Keynes ends up being so celebrated is that a lot of the sort of his ideas of how the economy worked, and you do want to sort of think about it in a similar way to how Adam Smith went about. It was a descriptive analysis of what he saw as market behavior, and then he, obviously, as you often do, extrapolate that in some way, and that always becomes part of the difficulty. What level of distinction, what level of detail do you need to then be able to have a conversation about the macro economy? And I think one sort of interesting, consistent sort of piece of this is that it ends up being sort of what formalization of human behavior do you ultimately want to buy into? When we talk about classical versus Keynesian ideas, at the heart of what distinguishes these ideas from each other ends up being really just a difference in terms of how markets ultimately behave, and at the heart of those arguments are ultimately how humans behave. And so, when we're talking about this sort of the structural components of an economic system, it's really important to keep in mind that the lines represent, at the end of the day, these transactions, and those transactions are defined ultimately by human behavior. And so I think it becomes a little bit more of an interesting conversation, and we'll get into some of the detail in just a moment, than just, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and then all that. I mean, that stuff's fun too, but, you can do a lot more interesting analysis here. So let's just, kind of start from where we wrapped up yesterday, which was just establishing the basic ISLM framework. So we have output on the horizontal axis, and we have interest rates on the vertical axis. It's important here to see that the Keynesian idea here comes very much from a classical sense, that interest rates ultimately become these important equilibrating factors in an economic system, and that's here as well. And the idea ultimately is that there is a goods market equilibrium that's going to clear. That's illustrated by the IS curve. If you're curious as to where the name IS comes from and what it represents, it's investment savings. It's the investment equals savings. So again, there's a classical idea right there in this sort of Keynesian idea, and I think that's again kind of nice. And then we have this equilibrium scenario in the money market, which we refer to as LM. LM comes from liquidity and money. It comes from that liquidity preference idea that Keynes came up with. And so the idea is that there's going to be this equilibrium in the goods market, IS curve. There's going to be equilibrium in the money market, the LM curve, and that is going to put the economy at a particular level of output and a particular real interest rate. And then there could be shocks to the system, or there could be policy changes in the system that are going to change the outcome variables here, right? The outcome variables being interest rates and output. Now, one sort of interesting sort of piece of all this is that we can think about the IS curve and we can think about the LM curve in the sort of context of this sort of these equilibrium conditions in goods and money markets. For now, one of the things that we want to do is we're going to think about this idea, this analysis, as occurring at a fixed price. So right now we're going to hold sort of prices at a particular level. Now we're not going to do that forever. In fact, it's very important for us to think about what happens when prices in fact change. But when we think about ISLM, it is at a particular price. And so that's important to sort of point out. The other thing that I want to point out as well is that the actual LM and IS curves, the nice thing about them is that they have these sort of micro foundation sort of esque characteristics. In particular, IS and LM have elasticities, right? So let's think about that for just a second here. So I have some prepared whiteboards here for us. So we can think about the IS and LM curves as having elasticities in the way that we think about any sort of a response function in economics as having an elasticity, right? Demand curves have price elasticity, demand has income elasticity, and elasticities just refer to one variable changes, and we're interested in how much the other variable changes. So a percent change in some variable relative to a percent change in another variable. And so in the context of ISLM, we can think about the slopes of ISLM as having practical sort of an interesting idea in terms of elasticity. So let's just briefly kind of talk about what that sort of looks like. So in the IS world, you sort of remember what the IS curve represents. It's investment response to real interest rates. So when we think about this in terms of elasticity, we're thinking maybe that there are certain scenarios or maybe even certain countries for which investment does not respond very much to real interest rates. And of course, if anytime you have a variable that does not respond much to another variable in terms of change, then that means low elasticity, or what we would refer to as inelastic. And so for the IS curve to be inelastic, which is right here, what that would mean is that in the goods market, and primarily in the context of investment, and then that sort of feedback loop with investment and consumption is, to what extent is investment sensitive to interest rates? Again, there could be scenarios where you think investors are very sensitive to interest rates, or scenarios in which they are not. Regardless, we can show that in the model. We can build that concept into the model, so we can have an elastic IS curve, or we can have inelastic IS curve. And the same thing for LM, right? So LM is just money demand response to interest rates, money demand. And the idea here would be that the less sensitive people are to interest rates, the inelastic the LM curve will be. So therefore, the steeper it will be, and more elastic, meaning that money demand is more responsive to interest rates. People are more sensitive to interest rate changes than your LM curve is going to tend to be flat. Now, beyond just that, there's sort of an interesting conversation to be had here about investor responsiveness to interest rate changes, as well as money demand responsive to interest rate changes. Because, as a bit of a side point here, put this into the conversation that we had about the permanent income hypothesis, right? This idea that changes in interest rates lead to changes in consumption behavior. And so the idea here would be, okay, let's bring that idea over and let's ask ourselves, okay, if interest rates change and people are very responsive to those changes in respect to consumption and perhaps investment as well, then we're going to have a very elastic IS curve. right? Now, what is the practical implication of a very elastic LM curve? Well, if you have a very elastic LM curve, what that means is that monetary policy becomes very powered. It becomes very powerful, right? So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that on the monetary policy side, right, we show that through the LM curve. And the simplest way to think about monetary policy in the ISLM analysis is just that expansionary monetary policy is going to cause the LM curve to shift to the right. So let's just say, for example, that we start with an LM curve there, and then we're going to shift that LM curve to the right, like this. So LM prime, something like that. Because the IS curve is relatively flat, is elastic here. This means that that change in monetary policy, that expansionary monetary policy, is quite powered. The subsequent change in output, or at least the pressure it would put on output, is going to be quite sizable. Whereas, of course, if we compare that to the world where we have inelastic IS, then we can see pretty clearly that a similar change, perhaps a similar shift in the LM, corresponds to a much smaller improvement in output, right? And so what this now starts us to sort of be able to have conversations about is not merely policy, but also under sort of certain conditions, what that policy is ultimately going to do to the macroeconomic situation. And so now we have a way to think about to what extent is monetary policy either going to be very powered or perhaps not very powered? And just sort of all else equal, it will be more powerful the more responsive investment is to interest rates. That really is, I think, practically straightforward. If I were to tell you that, okay, we have a current situation where investors are highly sensitive to interest rate changes, I then tell you that let's say the Federal Reserve decides to target higher or lower interest rates, you're going to naturally then assume, and you would be right to do so, that that policy is going to have a large effect, or at least a larger effect than it would if instead I told you that investors were not sensitive to interest rates, and so on and so forth. So, the idea here is, in a way, the sort of extent to which there is sensitivity to sort of interest rate changes, and then kind of what that means for investment decisions is an important part of how we think about policy, and an important part of how we think about what the government should or should not do. And then even beyond just the sort of context of policy, we can, if we're thinking about shocks, like there are exogenous shocks, right? So let's say for some reason there's an exogenous shock to inflation. Inflation is going to show up potentially in an LM shift, a money market shift, right? And so if the money market shifts back, it might behoove us to understand to what extent will that shift sort of actually result in a change in output versus sort of just a change in interest rates, right? Because that's the other thing to keep in mind here, is that, here you get this fairly large change in interest rates that corresponds to a fairly paltry change in output, right? And then over here, you get a fairly, you get a fairly small change in interest rates that corresponds to a fairly large change in output. And so this is sort of the way that policymakers also think. So they don't just simply think in terms of what shifts what, but they think under current circumstances or even maybe future circumstances, right? The other thing you have to keep in mind is, especially when we're talking about monetary policy, very often central banks are, in a sense, promoting a future that they want people to believe in. So they send signals about future policy. I mean, very often, for example, when the Federal Reserve meets and gives their press release regarding the FOMC meetings, they give a sort of forward-looking report about what they expect to do. And sometimes they even sort of lay out what they expect to do for the next year. And part of the reason why they're doing that is, in a way, the idea is that it makes people more reactive, therefore, to those announcements today, and then somewhat mutes their actual response to these policies later on. So in a way, one of the things the Fed can do is the Fed can sort of signal future policy is going to be in this direction. And then that's going to trigger behaviors today. And of course, they're well aware of this. And so, the way that I've always thought about it is that um, uh, if you're someone who, like, say, tends to show up late to parties, then you might have friends who tell you the party starts at 6, even though it doesn't actually start till 7, because they know you're not going to actually show up until 7 anyway, if the party started at 6. And so the idea here is you tell markets, okay, this is what we're going to do. In reality, what you're doing is you're getting markets to behave differently today. It's not manipulative in the sense that it's not that the Fed is not going to do this in the future. It's just that it sort of speeds up and actually makes monetary policy a little bit more powerful immediately than it otherwise would be. And you'll read about this a little bit more, but that's of course one of the sort of big concerns about monetary policy is that it takes a while. It takes a while to sort of ripple through, because you're talking about, for example, if the Fed is wanting to put down interest rates, they want to push interest rates down. They only control really one interest rate. That's the discount rate. And then so they maybe change the discount rate, but then maybe that's not the only. They don't just want to change the discount rate. They also want to maybe move some money supply stuff around as well, right? They want to change, they want to put downward pressure on interest rates partly through the discount rate. Then they want to put even more downward pressure on interest rates potentially through more expansionary monetary policy. So like increasing the money supply or targeting higher money supply, really. So you have the Fed, which is attempting to target higher interest rate, and it's going to take some time for the discount rate increase to ripple through the rest of the interest rates. And then you also have the money supply changes, which are themselves going to take some time. And then think about the nature of money supply changes and how that's actually supposed to affect the economic system. Go back to that basic model of the money supply that we talked about a few lectures ago. The idea is that the economy has this sort of amount of liquidity in which it can use for consumption, it can use for investment, and when there's more liquidity, we expect more consumption, we expect more investment, and when there's less, we expect less. And so, depending upon the sort of characteristics of the macroeconomy at that particular time, then the Fed is searching out a particular policy strategy that gets them to where they want to be at some point in the future. And the way in which they ultimately end up doing this is through a process of actual policy changes, and then also signaling to economies, investors, bankers, so on and so forth, what policy is going to be in the future. That'll be an important topic that we talk about next week when we talk about monetarism, and then ultimately we'll have a brief conversation about money supply targeting versus interest rate targeting. At the end of the day, whatever the monetary policy strategy ends up being, there's a sense that markets having a general idea of what monetary policy is going to be in the future is very important from a stability perspective, from a certainty perspective. Now, what that also means, as I said, is that it can mute policy somewhat. It can cause investors to become more or less responsive to policy changes. And so when you compare sort of the behavior of central banks in developed versus developing economies, one of the things you'll notice is that oftentimes in developing economies, central banks will sometimes seek out surprise monetary policy, because they know the surprise monetary policies will tend to trigger more sort of immediate and rapid sort of changes than instead this sort of stable, forward-looking policy posture that we see in developed economies. And part of that just has to do with the sort of priority set of developed versus developing economies, also the priority set of central banks. We'll talk a little bit more about exchange rate policy in the context of ISLM in tomorrow's lecture. And so some of that is going to sort of come back. But I thought for today's first lecture, let's just kind of ground the ISLM analysis, give it a little bit more complexity, a little bit more detail, but within the confines of a very sort of principles of economic idea, the concept of elasticities.